Ready? Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce Nick, who's going to be presenting. So what the heck is that radio thing anyway?
Hello. So yes, what the heck is that radio thing anyway? I put this talk together because a lot of people are getting into software-defined radio. You're getting these nifty little SDR dongles or getting the HackRF, other similar SDR peripherals, plugging it in your computer, and then starting to play with some nifty software to decode all the cool things out on the air. But what happens inside that device and on the other side of the antenna port? I would like to go over that and just kind of give you some of the basics of radio frequency stuff. As far as who I am, my name is Nick. Hi. I've been a ham radio operator for about 17 years. Computer geek, have cats and a dog. General, nerdy person. So let's go over just kind of a brief history of radio and what we've used to get to the point we are today. Started out long ago with spark gap transmitters, which were literally just a spark jumping a gap between a couple of conductors. It was a tiny little lightning bolt, essentially, that was just modulated to produce a certain frequency output. So this was great for Morse code, because it just made a burst of noise that was louder than the background noise. Unfortunately, that burst of noise was very wide, so it took up a whole lot of the band that it was in. You couldn't have a whole lot of signals coexisting. It wasn't very efficient. We decided to go try voice and other communications methods. Morse code is still in use. They just kind of made it more spectrally efficient. One of the ways people could receive these signals was with a crystal radio, which is just a tuned circuit of a capacitor and inductor that's made to resonate at a particular frequency that you're receiving. Then it passes that signal into the crystal portion, which acts as just a diode, passes that into a speaker, and you can listen to your signal. These are cool because they are powered by the radio signal that they're receiving. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of power in this radio signal that they're receiving, so you have this tiny little speaker that's producing a tiny little bit of noise, not very good for general listening. The development of vacuum tubes in the early 1900s let us do amplification of these signals, as well as replace the crystal portion with other tubes. Then moving on, we got the transistors. Those are cool because they're very small, low power, and they don't produce all the heat that you got out of vacuum tubes. So we had little battery-powered portable radios at that point. Everyone was happy. Yay! Raise your hand if you remember the Walkman. Thank God. These radios, though, tend to be a little limited in what they can do, because once they're built, they only do what they're built for. The military in the mid-'80s decided to start researching how to make things more flexible. The idea is you take as much of the radio as you can and stick it into a computer. That way, if you come up with a new modulation scheme or something, you just write software for it, update the computer, there you go, you're good. So what does a software-defined radio look like? I'm just going to go over a quick design of how we build a basic SDR. So at its core, you have an antenna that pulls in a signal from the air, that feeds it into an analog to digital converter, which does exactly what it is called. It converts analog signals, like sine waves and such, that are coming in over the air, to something in the digital domain. That is then passed over to a computer or digital signal processor of some kind, where it's processed in software. Unfortunately, with just this basic arrangement, you get a lot of noise and unwanted signals into your system that mess everything up. So let's add a filter. This rejects anything we don't want, prevents aliasing, which is something I'll get to in a minute. But still, this isn't quite optimal. when you're receiving radio signals, the signal level at your antenna is measured in millivolts, which really is hard to detect. So let's throw an amplifier in there. That lets us boost the strength of the signal as it's fed into the analog to digital converter, gives us something we can actually measure. This is great. This gives us the ability to record a particular frequency into our software-defined radio. What if we want to tune it? There's always a broad range of signals that we can get to, and we'd like to be able to get to them. So there's a cool property of radio signals where if you mix two signals together, you get the first signal, the second signal, the sum of the signals, and the difference of the signals. So if you have a 100 megahertz signal that you're mixing with a 110 megahertz signal, you get those two original signals. You also get 210 megahertz out and 10 megahertz out. So we put together a little system like this, where we have the LO down there is a local oscillator that is just a reference signal that we're generating to mix with our input signal through the mixer. And then we add another filter after it. So in the case of those two signals I mentioned before, 100 megahertz and 110, we get rid of the original signals entirely, as well as the sum, and then we pass only the 10 megahertz signal through to the analog to digital converter. There's another way of doing this too, where you set up your local oscillator and have two mixers. Then the oscillator feeds a sine wave and then a 90 degrees out of phase wave or a cosine wave into the other mixer, and you end up with what's known as the in phase and quadrature signals. The disadvantage of this is obviously there's a lot more stuff you have to put in, it's more complex. The advantage is when you're sampling a signal with just a single analog to digital converter and you just have that one signal that's coming through the mixer, you have to sample at twice the rate of whatever your signal is. I will show you why in just a minute. But the INQ system, you don't have to do that. So it increases your parts count in an SDR, but it means you don't have to go find as fast of analog to digital converters. So trade-off here and there. As for why you have to sample at twice the frequency, oh, that is hard to see. Well, we've got a blue high-frequency signal. My mouse over there. There's my mouse. So we've got our blue high-frequency signal oscillating here. We are sampling it at these yellow dots here, at each of these points, at a much lower rate than the original signal. Then, when you go to put all of these sample points together, you end up with this yellow wave, which looks nothing like the original wave. Well, it's a sine wave, obviously, but it is a completely different frequency. It's something that's not actually there. That is called aliasing. And that is why we need to sample at least twice the rate of what we want to get. In addition to the sample rate, the sample depth is important, or bit depth. This is needed for a couple of things. So if we have... my mouse again. Mouse, where are you? There we go. So we've got the signal over on the left. It's a sine wave. And if this is an amplitude modulated signal, meaning that the actual strength of the signal is what encodes the information for you, trying to see any kind of difference in the amplitude where this is your sample size, or basically the bin in which you can store this sample, you're not getting any information out of this. You're saying, okay, yes, there is a signal here. It's doing something. I don't know what. Over here, we've got a whole bunch more samples, a whole bunch more data available in each sample. And that lets us see, okay, how strong is the signal at each of these points? Something else that's important for is what's known as dynamic range, which is the difference that you can resolve. I'm saying that backwards. It is the difference between two signal strengths that you can resolve. So if you have a really strong signal and a really weak signal, if you don't have enough sample or enough data stored for each sample, then you're not going to be able to see that smaller signal when that large signal is maxing out your bit bucket, basically. It's the same kind of concept as when you take a picture of a bright scene outside and you've got a shaded tree. You can either have the shaded tree in view and the bright sky be totally blown out, or the bright sky be in view and the shaded tree be completely in shadow that you can't see. Same thing, your camera doesn't have enough dynamic range to resolve that full range of light. What is it we are actually receiving? This is a chart of the United States frequency allocation spectrum. It has a ton of stuff on it. This usually comes in a 24 by 36 poster, and you got to get really close to actually see what is going on. This covers from 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz, and a hertz is just a measurement of the cyclic rate of a signal. So a 1,000 hertz signal, you're wiggling electrons up an antenna 1,000 times per second. You might hear some old school radio people talk about kilocycles. Same thing, but nobody says that anymore. So let's take a look down at the bottom. There's this little orange section. This shows us the radio spectrum itself, and then other kinds of electromagnetic radiation. So radio, infrared, visible light, X-rays, it's actually all the same. It's just as you go further over, it's significantly higher frequencies. And then just a little zoom in part of that spectrum. You can see there's still a ton packed in there. So the lesson there is the radio waves are very busy. And as far as what an electromagnetic wave actually is, you have a wave that is both electric and magnetic. You have the electric field component would be in, say, in this case, the vertical plane. It's wiggling along. And corresponding to it in the horizontal plane is the magnetic wave, also wiggling along. You pull those out of the air with an antenna. An antenna just can be a piece of wire, can be those funny things you see hanging up on your house to pull in TV signals. But all it does is it resonates at a particular frequency, and when a signal comes in at that frequency, it induces a voltage in your antenna, which can then be detected by your receiver. Antennas themselves are pretty cool. They are, like I said, tuned to radiate or receive as well at a particular frequency. They also have a certain amount of bandwidth specified. Bandwidth in RF is not the same as bandwidth in internet. It is literally just the width of the band. So if you have an antenna that's tuned for 200 megahertz and it has a bandwidth of 10 megahertz, it would cover from 195 to 205 pretty well. Antennas have a property listed known as gain. Some people see this as, oh, this is how much power my antenna increases. Actually, all it is how much power your antenna focuses. You don't get something for nothing. So wherever you're increasing your amount of signal, you are decreasing the amount of signal in another area. This is a polar radiation chart. This indicates a highly directional antenna. You can see that it's got these large lobes of signal pattern off to the right in both the vertical and horizontal planes. But over on the sides and back, there's basically nothing at all. Yes, and decibels are a logarithmic scale. So every 10 dB increase is a factor of 10. So 10 dB is 10 times more, 20 dB 100 times more. Handy rule of thumb to remember, 3 dB is double. So when you see a 6 dB antenna versus a 3 dB antenna, it's twice as much focused radiation and wherever it's going. 9 dB would be 4 times as much, etc. I think I mathed that right. And the I in this is isotropic. So antenna gain is referenced to an isotropic antenna, which is a perfect radiator in all directions, which doesn't exist. So why do we use this? I don't know. But there it is. Another measurement you might see in transmit power is dBm, which is decibels related to milliwatts. So 0 dBm is 1 milliwatt, and then goes up or down from there. You can actually have negative dBm numbers. That's just very, very low power, 0.1 milliwatts, hundredth of a milliwatt, etc. And there are a whole lot of different antenna types. These come in many shapes and forms and do all kinds of different things and have all kinds of different properties of directionality or non-directionality, different frequencies they cover, etc. As far as how we actually use all this stuff to communicate data, we end up modulating the signal somehow. That is, we take our stream of meaningful data and then do something to it to encode it into the radio signal as it goes out. On the chart here, we have amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, which are just analog signals you get on your radio in your car. Amplitude modulation encodes the audio signal in how much it wiggles the transmit power. So if you are encoding a 1000 hertz audio tone, just like a about that, that is how fast you are wiggling the transmit power of your AM signal up and down. FM also uses wiggling of your signal related to the audio frequency. What it does, though, is instead of changing the transmit power, it wiggles the transmit frequency around some center frequency. There's some set amount that it can do that. It's known as deviation. Regular walkie-talkies are either 2.5 or 5 kilohertz deviation. FM broadcast radio, I think, is 200 kilohertz, so they can encode more data and get better audio fidelity. That's all analog, though. That's not interesting. The digital stuff is cool. This is binary frequency shift keying, which actually looks a lot like FM. All you're doing is changing the frequency at which you're transmitting based on whether you're sending a 1 or a 0. So you send it, slightly higher frequency for a 1 or slightly lower frequency for a 0. Then we get into the really weird stuff. This is quadrature amplitude modulation. So what this does is it takes the in-phase and quadrature signals, which are when you take your signal and deconstruct it into what's the original signal and then what's 90 degrees out of phase. You can plot that on a graph, figure out how strong the signal is at each point, and then it draws this nifty constellation. And then each of these points encodes a different set of bits. And something also to remember with these is you have your symbol rate and your bit rate, which are different. Because each of these symbols, in this case, encodes 4 bits. This is QAM 16. US cable TV is QAM 256. So you can basically encode an entire byte in each symbol. And then, how much can we send? There is an entire field under information theory studying channel capacity, which is how much can we cram into this data channel given different conditions. There are a lot of equations, a lot of different formulas, a lot of different theorems. The Shannon-Hartley theorem is one of the more basic, easy ones to reference. This deals with a data channel that has a particular type of noise distribution in it. So if we take this formula, plug in some numbers, and say we have a signal that's 20 megahertz bandwidth. Our signal strength as received is negative 70 dB. Our noise floor, so what the actual level of noise is below our signal, is negative 90 dB. According to this, we could cram a maximum of 86 megabits per second through. So if we take that same condition and then we say, okay, we're going to bump up our signal and improve our noise floor. Let's give ourselves 50 dB of range, of headroom rather than 20 dB. It goes up to only 112 megabits per second. That's not too much more. Because, again, when you're looking at the relative signal strengths, they're measured in decibels, which is logarithmic. So when you make changes like that, the bit rate is going to be a logarithmic relationship as well. Now, if we take those same conditions and just double our bandwidth, then we actually fully double our data rate as well. Those are a linear progression. So, signal, you can play with a little, but unless you make huge gains, it's not going to make a significant difference. But if you can give yourself a lot more RF bandwidth to play with, that helps a lot. Also, there are the MIMO systems, like with 802.11ac, where you have the 2x2 or 3x3 streams. That also helps quite a bit. It's not linear. I don't actually know what the correlation is. I don't believe it's logarithmic, though, with the number of streams. And that's all I have to talk about with radio today. I've got a bunch of resources, and oh god, those links don't show up. But I'm going to put my slides online. There are references here for some ARRL resources, which is the Amateur Radio Relay League. It's the organization that handles ham radio stuff in the U.S. There's also some training videos from Michael Ossman, who made the Hack RF. Some cool stuff there. And then there's the wireless CTF training. They just had a talk, actually. Good stuff. Mm-hmm. Yes. Those. Sorry. Okay. So, the question is, what is the hello world of SDR? And yes, one of those little $20 RTL dongles that you can find on eBay, or Newelec is a good company. They've got some good stuff. Yes, NOO-ELEC. Grab one of those devices. It's a TV tuner dongle that has a hacked driver that turns it into a general purpose receiver. It's very cool. And then the first video in Michael Ossman's series will show you how to use the GNU Radio Companion software to build yourself an FM broadcast receiver in software. And that's pretty cool. So you can set it up and put together all these filter elements, and then, hey, you can listen to broadcast radio. Not with that. No, you'd have to. They encrypt their stuff, so you can. There are things you can do to receive the bit stream. Yep. Yep. There you go. And then, like I said, I'm going to be putting this slide deck on GitHub, which you can't see because I picked bad colors. So github.com/explodinglemur. You can find me on Twitter @explodinglemur, and then my very rarely updated blog that has essentially nothing on it right now, blog.explodinglemur.org. So yes, does anyone have any questions? Nope. All right. Thank you all.